Well, it looks like Revelation is finally over. It's not, but it looks like it. This week we are looking at Revelation chapters 17 through 19, and we're coming to the kind of what appears to be a final judgment. We're going to see that it's surprisingly, there's more to come next week as we look at the millennium and Satan again being judged, but it does look like this kind of beginning section of Revelation is coming to a close. This week, it's all about the judgment of Babylon, who's depicted here as a prostitute, as a harlot. And what does that mean? That's going to be the real big question of this chapter. We're also going to see Christ come riding back in on a white horse, and there's some different views on this as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at our 4 views of Revelation and start with the Historicist View. Now, the Historicist View was really developed from the historical time period in relationship and very much so with the Reformation and the church. So the view of who the harlot Babylon is very clear in the minds of the historicists, and that is the papal system. It's the Catholic Church and the corruption that they saw within that. And we see in Revelation like a description of the beast that applies to this whole situation. So we have I think how you break that down with what's the difference between the beast and the papacy becomes a bit questionable. They're kind of interlinked. And so I don't know if they would say the Pope itself is the harlot Babylon and the Roman Catholic Church is the beast. But listen to this description right here. So this is from 17:8. The beast that you saw is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit. So it was, and then it quit being, so it is not right now, and it will ascend out of the bottomless pit. This describes how the beast was Rome, which is going to become the Roman Catholic Church. So the beast was as this evil empire of Rome, and then when Rome fell, the beast was not. But then as the Roman Catholic Church started to develop, you begin to see the beast re-emerging out of the bottomless pit and is headed for judgment in the future. That's the historicist view of interpreting these things. And so this is called the historicist view because it's not favored now. It's kind of a historical viewpoint, and it's illustrative, I think, not so much in saying, okay, they got this right, but rather to maybe compare some of the other viewpoints that we have and then ask, are we going through the same roads as them? Because everything looked good in the historicist view in the 1700s, but not so much so now. And so the viewpoint that they had, is that there is a future judgment. And so as time is extended, looking forward to that future judgment, it's become a bit harder. I think it felt more imminent back when this was historically popular view. And so they see that the point in time where this judgment happens is in the future. So they've kind of looked at this timeline leading up to this moment now when the Catholic Church is being oppressive and they're seen as being controlled by demonic forces. And so they're looking at this section as being in the future when Christ is going to bring judgment and return. And the rider on the white horse represents the ongoing conquest of Christ through his word or his continuing judgment of his enemies. And so they do see a future event with the judgment, but they also see maybe not necessarily an end of the world kind of thing in that. It could be rather a judgment for the Catholic Church. And so So I think looking at the Protestant Reformation, there might have been an idea that this was the moment, this was the judgment, and it was going to bring about all of this change and reveal and destroy the Catholic Church. And again, that's not played out very well historically. Our next point of view is the Preterist point of view. And in this, there's a sharp debate. What exactly is Babylon? What is the harlot? It's either Rome or Jerusalem. Now, I know these seem like very different things, but there is reasons for both. There's language in here that is very reminiscent of Rome, and it just seems so obviously talking about Rome. On the other hand, there's also language that's very reminiscent of Israel, and there's some points in here that don't exactly make sense for understanding this as being about Rome, particularly in relationship to covenant relationship that's portrayed here in marriage kind of terms. Now, if this is talking about Rome, it's really talking about the judgment that's going to come upon them for the persecution of believers, for the persecution of God's people, and for their own idolatry and worshiping the beast themselves, their own system, rather than God. However, if it's talking about Israel, it's a little different, and we see within this imagery of a harlot something that has been used very often in the Old Testament. This is a frequent image used by prophets to talk about how Israel abandoned their covenant relationship with God. See, on one hand, you have covenant of marriage, a perfect example of God's relationship with his people. And we see that here in this section. There's actually a marriage feast where the lamb is going to marry his bride. And that is the good. That's what's to be held up. That is the ideal. And Israel should be doing that ideal. But instead of that, instead of enjoying the marriage feast, they are acting, according to this interpretation, as a harlot, abandoning that, like total disregard for marriage covenant. And in this case, that's a symbol for the covenant relationship between God and Israel. That's a strong argument to see Israel and the harlot being related together in the mind of John. So either way, we know that we're facing a judgment here in this passage, and we know that it is in large part centralized in the first century. That's the Preterist view, that it's already happened. However, when it comes to Christ's return, things are a little different. The majority of preterists hold to the view that Christ will return in the future. So there is not a question, has Christ returned already? That's something that's going to happen in the future. But in this particular element of Christ returning on a white horse, is this that return that will be in the future? Is this that end times Christ's return, or is it something that has happened in the past? And this is where preterists are going to say that Christ returning on a white horse in chapter 19 is something that happened in the past. But to be clear, most preterists are not denying that Christ will return in the future. So Christ's return on a white horse in this passage is not about his final return, but instead about bringing judgment to those who in the past who were persecuting believers. So their idea is that Christ is active in the world in the past and even today, and will be active in a unique way in the future. Speaking of future, that brings us to the futurists, and they definitely do see this as a future event. Now, this section as a whole about Babylon is seen as sort of a parenthetical element. So rather than being a progression in the story to the next stage or a linear thing, it's looking back to what's being described in the bowls. So when we have that judgment being poured out, well, this is taking that idea of judgment and looking at it from a different angle, particularly at Babylon. So it's zooming in to something that happened already rather than chronologically moving to something new. And there's two broad ways that futurist camp interpret Babylon. One is to look at it very symbolically. So Babylon represents a religious state forming under the Antichrist in end times. So they're going to see real judgment brought on this, but it's not about a literal city or a literal figure. It's rather about the system as a whole, that this is using imagery to describe a system. Now, some interpreters see this as the Catholic Church, that they see as being corrupted Christianity, while others see this as competing religious or ideological positions that draw worship away from God. Either way, it's seen as a system rather than like an individual place. On the other hand, you have some futurists who hold that this is a literal description of an actual city. Babylon may be the capital city of an actual place in the Middle East or in Rome, and that destruction is going to come to this city, to the seat of power for this corruption. In either case, the city is representative of the system as a whole, whether that's strictly symbolically or as an actual city that is representative. For example, Washington, D.C. is a literal city that's representative of America. So it's both literal and representative. So everybody's agreeing that this is representative, at least, of this system of false worship. And that system is going to face literal, actual judgment, no matter which way you look at it. And what we have here with Jesus coming on the white horse is Jesus literally, and this is agreed upon, returning. So this is his actual coming back to earth and returning in judgment. Our last point of view is the idealist view. And in this view, Babylon and the harlot represent the world system as the seducer of the godly. The destruction of Babylon here is depicted and applies to John's current time about the relationship with Rome and about judgment that's coming there, but also to other times that this applies to any system that is seducing people away from true worship, right? This is a universal principle that God's judgment is coming. Ultimately, Christ will come in judgment of this system. Now, this could refer to the ultimate judgment of Christ on his second coming, but it also could refer to judgment along the way, right? So the fall of any empire could be seen in these terms, right? That there is a promise to anybody staying faithful that, hey, God will bless you, but this way is leading towards destruction, and so it's to be avoided. Or it could be referring to gradual and continual process of Christ coming as if on a white horse through a consistent, ongoing conquest over the world's systems through preaching of the gospel. And so these are two views, and they're not necessarily in competition. It could be both of these. Once again, there is a scene of Christ's return. This is actually the fifth such scene. We've also seen Christ's return in chapter 6, 11, 14, and 16. And all of these can be seen as reminders of God's returning to us in a real way, God's promise to be coming in the future in a way here in the world, and God's ultimate promise to return at the end of the age. Well, there you have it. You have 4 separate views of Revelation here. And next week, I think I jumped ahead last week and I said this was going to be this week. That was incorrect. Next week is the millennium. We have 1 chapter only about the millennium because it is such a big topic. So we're going to see Satan cast into hell. We're going to see Christ reigning for a millennium and then Satan coming back for one final judgment. So we'll be looking forward to that. See you next week as we continue to read Revelation and try to understand God's word together.